Please join me in welcoming Noam Chomsky to Manchester.
Tell me this isn't working. It is? Yeah, I'm not a great believer in conspiracy theories, but I'm getting the couple of days I've been in England, I've been developing some suspicions about the British Secret Service. I gave a talk in Oxford 2 days ago, some huge auditorium. The minute I started talking, all the power went out. It's one of the reasons I'm hoarse. I had to scream for an hour and a half. The minute I stopped talking, the power went on. And then when I heard this one go off, I figured this can't be a coincidence. So I expect this to go off any minute. We've just passed, as you know, the first anniversary of the President's declaration of victory in Iraq. I'm sure you saw the television pictures, the carefully staged extravaganza on the aircraft carrier properly placed in the harbor for the right views of the setting sun or whatever it was. I'm not going to speak about what's happening in Iraq on the ground. There's more than enough information about that coming. We can all draw our own conclusions. Instead, what I'd like to do is to comment on the new Imperial grand strategy that was supposed to be set in motion with the conquest of Iraq and where it stands today, actually much less successful than I had predicted, and what that implies about what's coming next. The phrase "New Imperial Grand Strategy," I should make clear, is not mine, nor incidentally is the phrase "the world's second superpower." The phrase "the world's second superpower" comes from a very unhappy New York Times article reporting the mid-February 2003 demonstrations around the world and saying, well, it seems there are now two superpowers in the United States and world public opinion. I'm not particularly happy about that, but it's an accurate description. The phrase "New Imperial Grand Strategy" comes from the main establishment foreign policy journal in the United States, the Journal of Foreign Affairs of the Council on Foreign Relations. It appeared in an article that was published immediately within weeks after the release of the Bush administration National Security Strategy. It was September 2002, which was accompanied by a virtual announcement of the plan to invade Iraq. The UN was informed right away that it could be relevant, it's the word that the government used, they could be relevant by agreeing to authorize what the United States was going to do anyway, with Britain loyally following behind, in what's called a partnership, I think. I must say, when I got to England a couple of days ago, I saw a speech by Tony Blair reported in which he said he was going to stand shoulder to shoulder with George Bush. And the unkind phrase that immediately came to mind was shoulder to knee with George Bush, but it's too impolite to say, so I withdraw it. It announced the intention. The UN was told it could be relevant by authorizing it. Otherwise, it could go on, but it could be, as Colin Powell explained to them, they could be a debating society. Those are the choices for the world. The national security strategy itself was a very clear, forthright declaration of the intention to dominate the world indefinitely, by force if necessary, the one dimension in which the United States still reigns supreme, overwhelmingly so, and to destroy any perceived potential challenge to this dominance. And the invasion of Iraq was to be the illustration of the doctrine. Well, the doctrine itself, quite apart from the plans to invade, led to unprecedented protest around the world, including, interestingly, the foreign policy elite within the United States, pretty much across the board. Again, unprecedented. So in the journal Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, the new Imperial grand strategy, as it was called, was immediately criticized within weeks as a threat, as dangerous a threat to the United States and to the world. And the elite criticism was remarkably broad, but it was also quite narrow. It's not that the principle was wrong. There's very little criticism of the principle, but rather of the style of its presentation and the manner of its implementation. The basic thrust of the criticism was captured rather well by Madeleine Albright, Clinton's Secretary of State, also in the journal Foreign Affairs, in one of a series of articles about this. She pointed out that every president has a similar doctrine, but the president keeps it in his back pocket, kind of quiet about it, pulls it out to use when necessary, and that it's a serious error to sort of smash people in the face with it and to implement it in brazen defiance, even of allies, and to make it clear to them you have total contempt for them, let alone the rest of the world. That's foolish and dangerous. And that was the basic character of the criticism. Very broad, but also very thin. Albright herself, of course, knew that Clinton had a similar doctrine. She had been UN ambassador under Clinton, and in that capacity, she had informed the United Nations that the United States will act multilaterally when it can and unilaterally when it must. And when she went on to become Secretary of State, she was, of course, aware of the regular White House messages to Congress, where the meaning of that was spelled out. Clinton declared the right to use force to ensure access to markets and resources, even without the pretexts that Bush and Blair conjured up. Taken literally, the Clinton doctrine goes far beyond the national security strategy, use force to ensure access to markets and resources. But it was issued quietly. Messages to Congress. If Parliament is anything like Congress, nobody was listening or probably reading comic books or something. But it was quiet, and it wasn't reported, and it wasn't issued in a way to be offensive. And the implementation was similar. It was implemented, but in ways that allowed allies and others to feel that somehow their worth was higher than zero. And as Albright correctly pointed out in the same article, this doctrine goes far back, has a long tradition. She didn't give the details, but in the United States you can find the same doctrine in virtually the same words as the Bush strategy back as early as 1941, before the United States entered the war. The war was going on, but the U.S. wasn't in it yet. And the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations were running extensive sessions on how to run the post-war world. It was clear at that time that the United States would emerge as the world dominant power. Britain would be what the Foreign Office here later called a junior partner to the United States, and nobody would come close to the U.S. in wealth or power, and therefore it would be their task to organize the world, and in the plans to do so, I won't bother quoting it, but the wording is approximately the same as the national security strategy. But again, that was quiet. That was public, but it was never reported. You can't find it in scholarship. It's only known by people who have to know it. And it wasn't done with brazen arrogance. And, of course, there are plenty of other precedents outside the United States. Britain has a miserable, ugly, and vicious record, which I don't have to tell you about, and the continental powers are no different, the same elsewhere. So, nevertheless, despite the rich precedent, the new imperial grand strategy was understood to be highly significant. Henry Kissinger wrote about it. He called it a revolutionary new doctrine. And as he observed, it tears to shreds publicly and openly the 17th century system of international order, the so-called Westphalian system. Of course, it also throws into the ash can the UN Charter and international law. I think Kissinger apparently considered that too insignificant to mention, but it does. Kissinger felt that this revolutionary new doctrine was the correct one, but he also criticized, cautioned really about the style and the implementation. And he added a very crucial qualification, which is usually tacit. He said the doctrine is fine, but it cannot be universalized. That is, it's the United States alone that has the right of aggression at will. The U.S. may delegate it to clients, but the doctrine can't be a universal doctrine. So in other words, we must forcefully reject the most elementary of moral truisms, namely that we apply to ourselves the same standards that we apply to others. And Kissinger should be congratulated, in my opinion, for his honesty in correctly articulating doctrines that are prevailing but are usually concealed in rhetoric about virtuous intent and tortured legalisms and so on. He just said it straight out. Moral standards are not for us. We use force, nobody else does, and that cannot be universalized. That's good, that's clear. There was also some, not much, but some critical commentary on the new doctrine on quite different grounds. One, from an interesting source, was an article by Arthur Schlesinger, perhaps the most respected living American historian, Kennedy advisor and memoirist. As the bombs began to fall on Baghdad a year ago, Schlesinger wrote an article in which he recalled the words of Franklin Delano Roosevelt when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on what Roosevelt called a date which will live in infamy. And Schlesinger said Roosevelt was correct, and now it is Americans who live in infamy as the government adopts the policies of Imperial Japan. That was a unique, honest, near unique, honest criticism in the mainstream. He also added that the Bush administration had succeeded in converting a global wave of sympathy for the United States to a global wave of hatred for American arrogance and militancy. That was a year ago. Polls more recently show that it's far more extreme, and as you know from their very intensive polls in Iraq taken by British and American polling institutions, and the United States and Britain have succeeded in doing the same thing in Iraq. They've converted an initial wave of at least tolerance, if not sympathy, to intense hatred. I mean, they have even succeeded, according to the most recent published poll, in turning Muqtada al-Sadr into the second most admired figure in Iraq, second only to the Grand Ayatollah. And by now, polls show about, among Iraqi Arabs, 12 to 1. By 12 to 1, they regard the U.S. and Britain as an occupying force, not a liberating force. If you add Kurds who have their own aspirations, it gets down, according to the latest polls, to 9 to 1, which is unprecedented. I mean, the Germans didn't have that much opposition in occupied Europe. And that is an achievement. To have achieved that is a sign of some talent. It was also anticipated that the war would increase the threat of terror. That was predicted by most specialists and intelligence agencies, and that's happened as well. There are Middle East specialists who monitor attitudes in the Muslim world, and they express themselves to be astonished, I'm quoting, by the revival of the appeal of global jihadi Islam that had been in decline. Recruitment for al-Qaeda networks increased. Iraq, which had had no ties to terror before, became what Harvard's leading specialist on terrorism calls a terrorist haven. Iraq suffered its first suicide attacks since the 13th century. The suicide bombings last year, the year 2003, reached their highest level in modern times. And the year ended in the United States with a terrorism alert of unprecedented severity. On the anniversary of the invasion, the Grand Central Station in New York, the major rail station, was patrolled by heavily armed police with flak jackets and submachine guns. This was, of course, a reaction to the bombing in Madrid shortly before, the worst terrorist crime in Europe. A few days after the Madrid bombing, Spain voted out the government that had gone to war against the will of the overwhelming majority of the population, and had indeed been highly praised by U.S. and other Western intellectuals for showing its democratic credentials by following orders from Crawford, Texas, instead of and dismissing maybe 90% of the population. That was quite general at the time. But they voted out the government a few days after the Madrid bombing. Spain was no longer praised. It was then bitterly condemned for appeasing terrorists by voting the government out. Actually, what the Spanish voters voted for was withdrawal of troops unless they were under UN authorization. The commentators who condemned the Spanish voters for their weakness and cowardice failed to point out that this is essentially the position of about 70% of Americans, and it has been pretty much for about a year. The large majority, now 70%, holds that the United Nations should take the lead in Iraq in civil order control, security issues, economic reconstruction, working with Iraqis to establish some democratic government. There are differences between the United States and Spain, some crucial ones. In Spain, people know what public opinion is. In the United States, only those who do research projects know what public opinion is. You can find it out. There are intensive studies of public opinion. The other difference is that in Spain, people can vote on this issue. In the United States right now, it's just inconceivable. This could not enter the electoral agenda. You can draw your own conclusions from that. Ask yourself questions about England. There is a curious performance underway, according to its own estimate. It's not because Israel's so powerful, it's because it's an offshore U.S. military base in effect. So their Air Force is already more powerful than, say, Britain's or any other NATO power. And the United States is now sending them over 100 of the most advanced jet bombers, F-16Is, with the announcement that they can, that they're capable of flying to Iran and back. They also announced that these are updated versions of the F-16s that Israel used to bomb the Iraqi nuclear reactor, the Osirak reactor, in 1981. There's a kind of a story about that the Israeli bombing deterred Saddam's nuclear weapons program. It was known right away that that's not true. The Osirak reactor was inspected by the head of Harvard's physics department immediately. He's a nuclear power specialist, and he reported in Nature, the world's main science journal, that it's just not designed for nuclear weapons. However, we now know from defectors and other evidence that it did initiate Iraq's nuclear weapons program. Another indication of the standard cycle of violence inducing violence. The Israeli press, in their Hebrew versions, they don't translate this into English, adds that the United States is now providing the Israeli Air Force with what they call special weapons. Okay, we can guess what they are. But you can figure out what Iranian intelligence assumes. This is all aimed at Iranian intelligence, who, of course, read this material. They're going to have to make a worst-case analysis. You can figure it out. I don't know about it telling you. Perhaps the purpose is to incite some Iranian action that will be a pretext for an attack. Perhaps it's just to rattle the leadership and to contribute to internal conflict or chaos, but whatever it is, it's obviously seriously increasing threats which at this level are becoming threats to survival. Well, the collapse of the pretexts for invading Iraq are quite familiar, but not enough attention has been paid, I think, to the most important consequence of the collapse of the pretexts of Blair and Bush and others. The original pretext was that the U.S. has the right to attack a country if it has links to terror and is developing weapons of mass destruction. Okay, can't say that anymore. And there's a new doctrine that has been proposed which expands the right of aggression. The links to terror have been dropped, and it is now no longer necessary for a country to have weapons of mass destruction or even programs for developing, but to have, I'm quoting the official story from Colin Powell and others, it's enough that the country have the intent and ability to develop weapons of mass destruction. Okay, who has the ability? Any country that has a high school chemistry and biology lab has the ability to develop weapons of mass destruction. Who has the intent? Well, whatever Tony Blair and Jack Straw and their American associates say. To translate that into simple language, it means anybody is subject to attack, instant, devastating, unwarned attack at any moment if they just disobey orders. That's the new doctrine, far more expansive than the old one. And new military programs are being developed to enhance the capacity to carry this out. Actually, an extremely important one was announced immediately after the National Security Strategy was released, September 2002. Plans were announced right away with regard to militarization of space to shift from the Clinton doctrine. The Clinton doctrine was that the U.S. must control space, to shift from that to a new doctrine, from control of space to what's called ownership of space. Ownership of space means instant engagement anywhere in the world from space, putting any part of the world at risk of instant destruction thanks to sophisticated surveillance systems and lethal weaponry that's going to be placed in space which you're not going to own. Now that's quite in accord with the national security strategy. Control isn't enough. You have to go on to ownership. The world's intelligence agencies can read the Air Force Space Command Strategic Master Plan, from which I've just been quoting as easily as I can, or more easily, and they'll draw the natural conclusions. You can figure out what they will be. That increases the risk to all of us, a very severe risk. The collapse of the pretexts did lead to a new doctrine. Actually, it's not called a doctrine, it's called a vision. Actually, it's called a messianic vision by the elite U.S. press. Turns out that the war in Iraq was inspired by the president's messianic vision to bring democracy to Iraq and to the whole region. And the president affirmed the vision in a presidential address last November. It was interesting to see the reaction. I read as much as I could about it in England too, but mostly the U.S. The reaction ranged from, at one end, just rapturous awe. The leading veteran correspondent of the Washington Post, the former editor of the International Herald Tribune, concluded breathlessly that that shows that the Iraq invasion was the noblest war in history because it was inspired by a messianic vision. There were those who criticized the doctrine, the vision, namely that it's beyond our means. It's generous and noble, but beyond our means. The beneficiaries aren't worth it. They're too backward. Others may not share our nobility and altruism and such problems. That this is the motive for the invasion is presupposed, isn't even discussed. It's just presupposed in news reporting and commentary, and then you're either critical or in awe. As a research project, you might look for the evidence that this is the reason. It turns out that the evidence reduces to one fact. Our leader announced it. Therefore, it is true. Period. North Korea couldn't do better. Just check that out and see if it's true. Also, to accept that this is the motive requires suppressing your knowledge that if that's the motive, Bush and Blair must be among the most astounding liars in history, because when they mobilized the world for war, tried to, there was a single question. Is Iraq going to live up to getting rid of its weapons of mass destruction? It turns out they're now saying that was a total lie. The real reason was our messianic vision, and we're supposed to accept that as gospel truth and sort of forget the fact that the people who are telling it to us are also telling us they're among the most extreme liars ever. But properly educated intellectual class is quite capable of this. You can check for yourself. I've yet to find, I have not found an exception with considerable search, except way out on the margins. Actually, there is one exception, one glaring exception. A few days after the president revealed his vision, the Washington Post published the results of a U.S.-run poll in Baghdad, the one I mentioned before. People were asked why they thought the U.S. invaded Iraq, and there were some who agreed with roughly 100% of articulate Western opinion, namely that the goal is to bring democracy to Iraq. In Baghdad, 1% agree with that. 5% thought that the goal was to help Iraqis. This is last October, not way before all of the latest revelations. And the rest said the obvious, what I already mentioned, the view that's the idea that's inexpressible in the West. Well, Iraqis don't have to know American history to understand what the noble vision means. We can look at that history and find it out, but they don't have to. They know their own history. That's enough. So, for example, they know that England created Iraq, modern Iraq, drew its borders, and created it so that England, not Turkey, would get control of the oil in the northern area, and also that Iraq would have to be independent because it would have no access to the sea. That's why the Principality of Kuwait was carved out. So that's the way it was created. They know that England also had noble visions, messianic visions. Iraq was independent, had a constitution, parliament, all sorts of nice things. Meanwhile, the British Foreign Office and Lord Curzon were carrying out their own plans, which were released 60 years later. England's much slower than the United States, but they're there. And it turns out that they were doing what you'd expect. Their plan was that Iraq and other countries of the region should be what they called an Arab facade, that Britain would rule behind various constitutional fictions. Actually, that conception was just reported 2 or 3 days ago by a senior British official who said that after the turnover of sovereignty to Iraq on June 30th, Iraq will have full sovereignty, but in practice it won't exercise it fully. That's familiar. Arab facade that we rule behind various constitutional fictions. And Iraqis didn't need the British Foreign Office records to know this. They know it from their own experience, like the people at the wrong end of the clubs typically. And furthermore, they can see what is now happening right in front of their eyes. So the United States is building the world's biggest embassy in Baghdad, sensitively using one of Saddam's main palaces to house it. The head of the embassy, the new ambassador, is John Negroponte. When he was appointed, the Wall Street Journal had a good article about him in which it said he called him a modern proconsul. And he said that Wolfowitz learned his trade as a proconsul during the Reaganite phase of the current administration in Washington, when he was ambassador to Honduras, presiding over the second largest embassy in Latin America and the biggest CIA station in the world. Not because Honduras is such a center of world power, but because his responsibility as proconsul, which is what he was called in Honduras, his responsibility was to supervise the military bases from which the U.S. mercenary army was carrying out a destructive, murderous terrorist war against Nicaragua to stop another effort of successful defiance. Practically destroyed the country, but it's regarded as a grand success because now no more successful defiance. That was his job in Honduras. So he learned his trade as a proconsul. That led to the United States being brought to the World Court, condemned by the World Court for international terrorism, ordered to terminate the crime, after which the current incumbents in Washington, including the moderate Colin Powell, escalated the crime. They were ordered to pay reparations, huge reparations. You know what happened to that. When the U.S. refused, Nicaragua took it to the Security Council. There were 2 resolutions in which the Security Council restated and supported the World Court judgment and called on all states to observe international law. They were vetoed by the United States, with Britain politely abstaining, and they're out of history because they say the wrong thing, like terror against other people. Well, that's Negroponte's history, and he's perfectly qualified to run the world's biggest embassy in the world in Iraq, in order to transfer sovereignty to Iraqis, we're told. Okay, you can decide whether you want to believe that. Iraqis can also see, as we all can if we want, that the U.S. is insisting on keeping military bases and military forces essentially permanently, and as Paul Wolfowitz puts it, only a stable, prolonged U.S. troop presence and a weak Iraqi army will allow us to nurture democracy in Iraq. Okay, you can decide what you think about that. Wolfowitz, incidentally, is called the idealist in chief of the Bush administration, the visionary leading the crusade for democracy. If there were time, there isn't. I'd run through his record, which is intriguing. You rarely find anyone with a record of such visceral hatred of democracy and support for tyranny shown in case after case, but we'll put that aside. It doesn't matter for the Messianic vision that Iraqis overwhelmingly want Iraqis to be in charge of security. Not all, again. So 7% of Iraqis want U.S. forces to be in charge. 5% want the U.S.-appointed governing council to be in charge. These are British-run polls last October again. Now, of course, it's much worse. But it just doesn't matter. 6 months ago, not now, 80% of Iraqis said they had no confidence in U.S.-UK forces or in the civilian authorities. Now, of course, much worse. But none of this has any relevance to the Messianic vision. Well, Iraqis can also observe the economic measures that are being imposed by the current proconsul, Paul Bremer, answerable to the Pentagon. They, in effect, open up the Iraqi economy and banking system to effective U.S. takeover. Britain will get a few crumbs in honor of its cooperation. The plans were immediately denounced by Iraqi business leaders who pointed out that they would be destroyed. Bremer also imposed a 15% top flat tax, which will make Iraq one of the least taxed countries in the world, completely unable to rebuild the devastated infrastructure from the U.S.-British sanctions and the wars, and to carry out badly needed social spending. That's all gone. Iraqi businesses don't like it, but there should be fewer problems with Iraqi workers. Iraq does have a militant, active labor tradition, despite all the repression. But the occupying army, as soon as they moved in, took immediate action to destroy the unions, broke into union offices, arrested the leaders, blocked strikes by force, enforced Saddam Hussein's brutal anti-labor laws, and handed over concessions to bitterly anti-union U.S. businesses. These economic proposals, incidentally, are completely familiar. Those are the kind that created the Third World. The Third World was compelled by force to accept market discipline. The rich countries, England, the United States, Germany, up to Japan and East Asia, the ones that developed, they just, they may teach the rules of those principles in graduate economics courses, but they didn't observe them. They relied on a powerful state intervention to drive the economy and protect it. And those are the ones that grew and developed. The ones that had the principles imposed on them by force are what we now call the Third World. So there's nothing unfamiliar about the proposals being made for Iraq. Well, it's an open question whether Iraqis can be coerced into submitting to the nominal sovereignty that's offered under various constitutional fictions designed by the occupying power to block true sovereignty. It's been astonishing to see their resistance to this. I don't mean bombs and guns, which are the least of it, just the steadfast refusal to accept the demands of the occupying powers. That has been extremely impressive, and it's forced them to back down. That's one question. For privileged people in the West, people like us, there's a far more important question, and that is whether we will permit our own governments to nurture democracy in the style of idealist-in-chief Paul Wolfowitz, as in their traditional domains, in fact, for a long time. Well, right at this point, crucial questions arise about the nature of Western democracies and their future. These are extremely important topics. They're obviously the most important ones for us, and they're important for everyone because it's quite literally true that the survival of the species is at stake, and the answers to these questions. But those are for some other time. Thank you.
If you had 1 minute with George W. Bush, what would you say, beginning now?
To tell you the honest truth, I doubt very much that George Bush has much to do with policy formation. I mean, the way the presidency is more or less like royalty in the United States. So the Queen of England opens Parliament with a speech, right? But nobody asks whether she believes it, or whether she understands it. Her role it's a ceremonial role. You present, it's a role that's connected with unity of the people, patriotism, obedience, and so on and so forth. The content is something else. That's by people who run the country. The people who run the country are those in political office, but much more importantly, they're associates in the concentrations of private economic power. That's where the country's really run. And that shouldn't be a big secret either. America's leading social philosopher, John Dewey, who's right, very mainstream American. He pointed out once that as long as we have what he called industrial feudalism rather than industrial democracy, that means tyrannical, totalitarian institutions running the economy, command economies basically. As long as that's instead of industrial democracy, like workers' control and management, as long as we have that, then politics will be the shadow cast by business over society. And that's approximately accurate. Now, it's not that the state has no independent choices, it does, but an amalgam. Exactly the role that George Bush plays in this is very dubious, questionable. In some cases, like say Ronald Reagan, he probably didn't even know what the policies were. He was reading off his note cards or the teleprompter or something like that. And Bush may have some knowledge of them, but I think he's mostly a ceremonial figure, trained to act in certain ways and so on. So if I had a minute with him, I would say, have you talked to God lately or something like that?
Well, we have a question from Dan Rigby, a two-part question. If John Kerry wins the presidency, will it make any difference in Iraq? And should Ralph Nader still stand?
If Kerry wins, which I think is unlikely, just looking at the relative funding of the two candidates, and elections are mostly bought, but suppose he does. I doubt if it would make much of a difference in Iraq. Their policies, it's very hard to know what Kerry's policies are. He's been very careful not to, his advisors have been very careful not to formulate them. But chances are it would be more like Albright and Clinton. That is, same policies, but not so stupidly and arrogantly formulated and implemented, which is a difference. And, in a huge system of power like the United States, those small differences can translate into large outcomes. The major difference between the two, I think, would be domestic. The Bush administration are real extremists. It's a narrow political spectrum, but they're way out of an extreme. They want to and they're pretty brazen and open about it again. They want to dismantle everything that has been achieved by popular struggle over the last century. Everything from the limited measures of social welfare, support systems, pensions, minimal medical care, to progressive taxation. In fact, about anything you can think of. They want to create a real utopia for the masters. Very powerful state. They're not conservatives. A very powerful state which serves the rich and powerful and somehow controls everybody else, one or another means. There is a kind of a quasi-fascist strain there. I don't like to use the term, but it's there. Except that the fascists did develop welfare systems, and they want to destroy those. And the Kerry will be less extreme in this respect, just as Clinton was less extreme. And those make big differences too. Like, you have a disabled mother you have to take care of. It makes a difference how extreme the policies are. Those differences, I think, are significant. That gets to the Nader question. My feeling is that it should be a very high priority to keep Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, those characters, prevent them from getting another mandate. If they do, they can be extremely dangerous in every respect. The difference between militarizing space under the conception of control and militarizing it under the conception of ownership may be the difference between survival of the species and non-survival. Neither is very attractive, but there are differences. And the same is true on the domestic front and to a limited extent elsewhere. So I do think it's a priority. Nader doesn't. I like him, known him for a long time. I like what he stands for and does. But I really think he's making a mistake. Actually, what he ought to do, in my opinion, and actually there are things he could do to be in the campaign and not affect the outcome. There's some technical things he could do. Actually, one of them was proposed by a well-known constitutional law professor at Yale University, Bruce Anderson, and it's an interesting suggestion. In the U.S. system, you don't elect people, you elect electors. Okay? And the electors elect the people, the candidates. I mean, that was part of the original Madisonian system to try to marginalize the public and keep power in the hands of the wealthy. Now it doesn't have quite that function, but the system is still there, which means that Nader could, if he wanted to, run, but select the Democratic electors. That would mean you're voting for Nader, but the elector is Kerry's. Okay, so that's a way to run and use the opportunity to say whatever you want and bring issues up and so on and so forth, but not affect the election. I mean, that's one way to do it, and there are other ways. And my opinion is that's what he ought to do. It's fine to bring up issues and discuss things and so on and so forth, but to act so as to bring back into office the people around Bush, which is exactly what it is, that's just not sensible in my opinion.
Yeah, Ron Senchak, former U.S. Navy from Newark, New Jersey, first became political in the Vietnam War, when in saluting the flag and came out burning it. And I've been very active in Manchester in the Stop the War Coalition. We've over 20,000 people on the streets, and we're still going strong here. But I did want to ask you the differences that you might see between the anti-war movement in the 60s and the early 70s and the anti-war movement now. I think it's much more, I'm optimistic. People around the world are talking about a different world now, much more than they were before, and I'm optimistic.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. I mean, in the 1960s, we kind of forget, but the anti-war movement didn't exist for years after the war in Vietnam began. Literally didn't exist. I mean, there was so little opposition to Kennedy's attack on South Vietnam that nobody even remembers that it took place. I mean, you have to study to find out it took place, but it did. In 1962, Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam, initiated chemical warfare in South Vietnam, which has an estimated 600,000 victims. It's not small. Started rounding up people, programs to round up ultimately millions of people in what amounted to concentration camps. And that then just escalated, and there was no protest at all. You know, I mean, no American president could even dream of doing that today. And that's because of the activism that developed later in the 60s and even more so in the 70s and 80s and 90s, which has just changed the country, changed consciousness enormously. I mean, finally, an anti-war movement did develop in the United States, and same in Britain, I should say. Anti-war activism here was extremely low in the 60s, virtually non-existent. I remember very well because I was flown over by leaders of the anti-war movement here through the 60s because they needed somebody to give a talk. You know, this went on for a long time. By the late 60s, it had developed. It had become big, but kind of narrow. It expanded enormously afterwards. I mean, the major popular movements that one thinks of as movements of the 60s, the main ones that really influenced the society and changed it are not from the 60s. They're from the 70s and the 80s. So take, say, the women's movement. That barely existed in the 60s. I mean, it really took off in the 70s. It's had an enormous effect on the whole society. The environmental movement didn't exist in the 60s. It came later. The anti-nuclear movements, the solidarity movements are mostly in the 80s, and they're by now huge. Well, you get back to this war. This war is unique in the history of Europe, hundreds of years. European imperialism, including the United States. It's the first time in European history or American history that there was massive protest against a war before it was launched. I can't think of any historical example of that, where there was any protest against a war before it was launched, let alone massive protest. Well, that's an indication of very big changes in popular understanding and consciousness. And you can be certain that people in power know it. Here are other things that aren't told you very often, but you can find them if you want. The Pentagon Papers were very interesting and unusual in that it was not declassified, it was stolen. So it's like getting the archives of a conquered country, where they don't have a chance to purify them. So the Pentagon Papers are rather revealing. The Pentagon Papers run from the late 40s to 1968, the end in 1968. The last part of the Pentagon Papers is right after the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive in January 1968 convinced American business elites that the war isn't worth it. They've already won. They've already destroyed South Vietnam. There isn't going to be any successful defiance, any effect on others. So it's just a waste of money and time. And they essentially ordered Lyndon Johnson to call the war off. He was informed not to run for office, stop the bombing of North Vietnam, enter into negotiations, and he obediently followed the orders. But after the Tet Offensive, right afterwards, Johnson did want to send 200,000 more troops to South Vietnam. The Joint Chiefs of Staff objected. And the reasons they objected, which are described in the last pages of the Pentagon Papers, is that they said if they continued the war, they would need those troops in the United States for civil disorder control, because they would not be able to control constituencies that were out of control. And they mentioned them. Young people, women, minorities, others. They're just not going to control them. So they're going to need the troops right in the United States, and they refused to send them. Well, that's important. There was already a record. By that time, the top military, wanted the Army out. They were trying to get the Army out of Vietnam. Remember, then it was a civilian army. It was not a professional army. It's one of the reasons they shifted to a professional army, which is kind of like a mercenary army of the disadvantaged. That's what it comes out to. The United States made a bad mistake in Vietnam. It's the first time an imperial power tried to fight a colonial war with a citizens' army. Now, that doesn't work. That's why the British used Gurkhas and Indians in Afghanistan and stuff like that. That's why the French have a foreign legion. I mean, every sensible imperial power uses mercenaries, usually local mercenaries from one part of the country, move into another, and that sort of thing. But the U.S. tried to carry out a straight, traditional imperial war of destruction with a citizens' army. And the civilians just they can't do that, I mean, sometimes they go off to extreme barbarism, but they just can't deal with this kind of situation. You really need professional killers for that, like the French Foreign Legion. I mean, they can do it. And in fact, civilians are also too integrated with the home society. So what's going on in, say, the youth culture in the United States in the late 60s was affecting the soldiers. I mean, it was getting to the point where soldiers were killing their officers, they were going off on drugs, and this. The Army really thought the Army was going to disintegrate, and they wanted them out. Well, that's another change. In 1980, when any president comes into office, first thing he does is call for an intelligence analysis of the world situation, obviously. Usually we don't find out about it for 30 or 40 years until it gets declassified. But in 1989, when Bush #1 came in, somebody in the Pentagon leaked a piece of it, or in the CIA. A small piece of it was leaked and barely published. I mean, it's there, but if you find it, it was interesting. It had to do with military intervention. Specifically, it had to do with what they called wars against much weaker enemies. And of course, if you're semi-rational, that's the only kind of war you ever get involved in. So what it said is, in the case of conflicts with much weaker enemies, the United States must win rapidly and decisively, because otherwise political support will erode. Like it's not the 1960s any longer, where you can go on for year after year smashing up a country and destroying it and nobody even bats an eyelash. Now that's the problem they're facing in Iraq. I mean, if it was the 1960s, early 60s, I mean, they'd just send the B-52s and destroy the place and there wouldn't be any problem. But they can't do that anymore. They don't have the options that Kennedy and Johnson had. You have to win rapidly and decisively, or else political support disappears. Well, that's a change. I mean, it's not utopia, but it's a significant change. And I agree exactly with what you say. These trajectories are very optimistic. I mean, you've got to make sure they go on.
Do you think there's a link between political Islam and terrorism as a secular fundamentalist the UK government and the US government would have us believe?
There's not going to be much time to talk about this, but there is some very good work on it. For example, a recent book by Mahmoud Mamdani, a Ugandan scholar at Columbia, exactly on this topic, just came out. And what he points out is that what the West calls terrorism is political Islam. I mean, it was secular. It was a secular political movement for a long time, but the secular political movement was just smashed. I mean, it was partly by outside force, partly by internal corruption. I mean, whatever the reason, the secular political Islam just didn't succeed. And people don't just give up hope at that point. They learn something else. And what they do is religious extremist Islam, which indeed was fostered by the same people who destroyed political Islam. So the United States and Britain and others destroyed political Islam by a good deal of violence. It wasn't the only cause, but it was a significant one. And they also fostered the religious fanatic Islam. I mean, the obvious case is Al-Qaeda. I mean, that's not a big secret. Who organized the Islamic jihadis in the 1980s? CIA, British intelligence, Pakistani intelligence. They scoured the world to find the most radical Islamic extremists they could find and brought them to Afghanistan and trained them and armed them and gave them Stinger missiles and the rest of it. The purpose was not to defend Afghanistan, which could have been a legitimate purpose. In fact, doing it probably prolonged the war in Afghanistan, delayed the Russian departure. Russian archives now show the purpose was quite different. It was to bleed the Russians. That's not legitimate. And in fact, they were carrying out terrorist acts inside Russia in the 1980s. Serious ones that almost led to a war between Russia and Pakistan, which would have been a nuclear war. After they had done their job of bleeding the Russians, the West figured, okay, we'll forget about them. But they didn't go away. They went back to their own countries or other places, and that's what's become the Al-Qaeda style phenomenon. It finally turned against the West for reasons that we know. And it's a form of political Islam. And that's happened in country after country. I mean, take, say, the Israeli-occupied one of the arguments against part of the Syria Accountability Act, I don't have time to go into it, is the claim that Syria is allowing offices of Hamas and Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, to stay there. Well, where did Hezbollah and Hamas come from? They come from Israel. I mean, Israel created both of them. In the case of Hamas, it did it consciously. I mean, in the occupied territories, Israel was supporting religious extremists in order to undermine the secular PLO, the political Islam. It wasn't even Islam very much. It was a political, secular movement seeking independence for the Palestinians. Well, that was the real threat. Israel preferred secular religious extremists. One of the only, I think maybe the only university in the West Bank that Israel sort of allowed to be funded was the Islamic University. At one point they were busing students from the Islamic University to Birzeit, the secular university, to break up strikes, protests. Where did Hezbollah come from? Did you ever hear of them before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon? I mean, they're the result of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, backed by the U.S., otherwise they can't do it. That was a vicious invasion. It killed about 20,000 people, destroyed a large part of southern Lebanon, led to resistance, and the resistance ended up being Hezbollah, which drove them out of Lebanon, and is now becoming a kind of political organization in Lebanon. Well, those are the purpose of the invasion of Lebanon. It was pretty open. I mean, it was expressed by the highest political military echelons. The purpose of the invasion of Lebanon was to eliminate PLO efforts at negotiation and political accommodation, which were just becoming embarrassing. It was very hard to fend them off. So they wanted to drive them out of Lebanon so they can forget about it. In fact, it was called by the Chief of Staff and others, the Lebanon War was called a war for the West Bank. I mean, there's a kind of a pretense in the West that Israel was reacting to PLO, rocket Katyusha bombings of northern Israel and so on. That's complete lies. I mean, total lies. I mean, if you read the Western scholarly literature, what they say is that for a year before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the border was quiet. Okay, the statement, the border was quiet, is a racist euphemism for the fact that the border was anything but quiet, except that the attacks were coming from south to north. I mean, Israel was bombing Lebanon, it was sinking ships in harbors, it was murdering people and so on, in an effort, increasingly desperate effort, to elicit some Palestinian reaction that could be used as a pretext for invasion. When they didn't get a pretext, they invaded anyway. That's called the border is quiet, meaning our guys aren't getting killed. But the actual reason was to try to undermine a political, secular, not even Islamic and Christian movement just calling for Palestinian independence. End result, Hezbollah. In the occupied territories, end result, Hamas. In Iraq, end result, Muqtada al-Sadr. In Algeria, it was the same kind of development. I mean, in Algeria, after the French left Algeria, they didn't go away. I mean, they penetrated the Algerian security services, the government, and so on. And probably they are responsible for a large part of the massive atrocities of the last 10 years. And one result of all of that is Islamic fundamentalist radicalism in Algeria. I mean, this happens all the time, not just in the Islamic world, elsewhere too. And people do not just say, okay, I quit when you destroy some political option. They find some other way. And often the other way is not very pretty. And often it's fostered by those who ultimately suffer from it. So yes, I think political Islam is the right word for it.
Okay, we have one last question. This is a question from Tom Conti. The question is, do you live in hope or despair? What inspires you about Western political activism? And what do you think is lacking today?
Well, first of all, it doesn't matter. I mean, whether you have hope or despair is kind of like a personal matter between you and your wife and children or something. Maybe not even that. It just doesn't matter. You do exactly the same thing, whether you're optimistic or pessimistic. Okay, so it really doesn't matter. It's a subjective question. But I think there's reason for hope for the reason that he pointed out before. There is a very definite trajectory which is positive. I mean, there's plenty of things that are horrible. We should talk about them. We're not trying to compliment ourselves on how wonderful we are. So you pay attention to what's wrong and try to fix it, and there's plenty. But the fact of the matter is that there's tremendous improvement in the general level of civilization in Western societies. Things that were simply taken for granted not many years ago are now intolerable, literally intolerable. It's not just in international affairs. I mean, take something like domestic abuse. Okay, I mean, 30 or 40 years ago, it wasn't even. That's life. What's there to talk about? So it was not an issue. Now it's a very big issue. And there's protection and understanding and so on. It hasn't gone, hasn't disappeared, but it's a lot better than it was. And the same is true of everything else. Across the board, there's now awareness and understanding of things that were just taken for granted as the way life is. I mean, I don't know this university, but I suspect it's Manchester, but I imagine it's kind of the same as MIT. At my own university. If you walk down the halls at MIT today, it's 50% women, about a third minorities, People are casually dressed, which reflects informal relationships among people without deference to authority and so on. If you'd walked down the same halls 40 years ago, white males, well-dressed, obedient, maybe 2 or 3 women and a couple of thousand people and so on. Well, this is more than symbolism. These are changes in the nature of the society. And those changes are going on. And we can foster them. They mean that today there is a basis for education and organizing that is much more advanced than it was not many years ago. There's still plenty of problems, but you could start from a higher plane. And there are plenty of opportunities. Just to finish, take something like, say, the World Social Forum. This is, again, completely unprecedented in history. There were attempts to develop what were called internationals, but they were very narrow, and they collapsed for reasons you know. This is the first organization which has the prospects, perhaps, of being a genuine international. As I'm sure you know, it's meeting in the South, like it meets in Brazil and India. The reason is because that's where the activism is. These things were initiated in the South, and very successfully. Big popular movements, lots of activism. Finally, the North sort of was drawn in on the periphery. And if you read about, when you read about it, you read, well, it began in Seattle. That's because if 500,000 people demonstrate in India, it didn't happen. But if something happened in a northern city, it happened. So therefore, Seattle is talked about as the beginning. That's not. It's the end. But it's important that the northern countries were drawn in. And now there is an international network of activists. It spawned 100,000 people show up of all kind, every imaginable kind of activist you can think of. It's now spawned regional and local social forums all over the place, which have the same general conception of what the world is and where they're going, but are looking at local problems, which is correct. They should be looking at what's right next to them. Those are all very healthy developments. They've never happened before. There's never been anything like them. And it does give a basis for moving on.